This is the Galaxy S24, and believe it or not, this thing has actually been out and in the wild for over 6 months now. Yep, you heard that right, it's already halfway through its life cycle. And here's the thing, I'm actually currently looking for a phone to become my new full-time everyday device, given how frustrated I've become with the Pixel series, and more specifically, Google themselves for not letting us have a customizable home screen on their devices. And I kind of really want this to be the phone that takes the mantle. I mean, I really enjoy its compact form factor. It's got a really customizable software experience, which we'll get into a little later on. And I also love the fact that it has 3 different cameras on the back, a main, an ultra wide, and a telephoto lens, which often isn't the case with phones of this size. And so it sounds perfect, right? But there's obviously always more to that story. And so after using it for over a month now, I feel like I'm finally ready to make my decision. So without further ado, let's dive in. Okay, let's start with design. And here's the thing about this phone's design. It is very, very similar to last year's S23, which itself was already not that different from the previous year's S22. I mean, we do have slightly thinner, still symmetrical bezels on the front of the phone, which I love. The side rails have been fully flattened out now and have been upgraded to this matte finish, which I also very much appreciate from an aesthetic standpoint. But I will say, whilst the side rails feel very similar to the upgraded titanium rails on the S24 Ultra, the S24 side rails are actually not titanium, and as a result, I actually think that they dent a little easier compared to those glossy rails from last year's S23. But aside from that, from a design standpoint, everything is pretty much exactly the same. And if you're someone who uses your phone in a case, then you genuinely won't be able to tell the difference between this phone and last year's phone. And whilst that doesn't bother me that much, I do find it very odd that it's almost impossible to, at a quick glance, distinguish between this very much flagship phone and Samsung's much more budget-oriented phones. Like, take a look at all of these phones on screen right now. I mean, where has the creativity gone? But maybe Samsung knows that most users are going to slap it in a case anyway, and if that is the case, pun intended, then I kind of get it. Do I still wish that they'd get a little more creative in regards to design though? Yes, I do. All that being said, like I said, I still love the compact form factor of this phone. I also love the side rails that they're now flat and have a matte finish. I love the matte finish on the back. And so yes, whilst it is very similar to last year's S23, I still love this phone's design. The display itself is still beautiful and technically brighter than last year's display, though I'll be honest, I can't really tell the difference. But Samsung did also give it an upgrade so that it now has that LTPO technology and it can therefore dynamically adjust its refresh rate in the hopes of saving more battery. So I guess Samsung has given it just about all the upgrades that it could have, but in terms of real world use, like I said, I genuinely cannot tell the difference between the display on this phone and the display on last year's S23. And if you thought the displays were similar, well, just wait until I tell you about the cameras. Like literally every single lens is identical to last year's S23, save for a very slightly wider 3x telephoto lens, which I thought was kind of weird. And look, I get it. Camera hardware is always meant to be pretty incremental for new releases each year, but the lenses on the S24 aren't just the same compared to the S23's lenses. They're actually also the same compared to the S22. And I guess I just wish that this phone had gotten some more tangible upgrades in the camera department this year. And like, as far as the fingerprint sensor goes, whilst it's still probably one of the best sensors on the market, it also hasn't gotten an upgrade in a few years at this point. And again, whilst the haptics are also very good, they're also unchanged compared to previous years. And so partway through this review, and I'm sure there's a good chance that you're sitting there thinking, well, aside from the design, it sounds like Sam isn't all that impressed by this phone, right? Well, that's actually not the case. You see, all of the features that I've listed so far, whilst, yeah, they've hardly gotten any upgrades compared to last year's phone, that doesn't mean that they're all not still really great. Do I wish Samsung pushed the envelope a little more? Of course, but does that mean that the S24 is a bad phone? Absolutely not. And in fact, despite everything that I've said so far, I actually think it's still one of the best phones that you can get. And the biggest reason for that, more than any standalone feature, is that it just works. Like with One UI 6.1, whilst it still isn't the most fluid software experience on the market, it has got to be up there as one of, if not the most reliable. For example, the phone never gets overly warm to the touch. I never have any sort of glitches or hang-ups when I'm using the phone, and that's both in terms of general UI browsing, but also when I'm using the camera app. And this, for me, is often where I see the most issues when I'm using other Android phones. Like the two other phones that I've used the most this year, aside from this and the S24 Ultra, the Pixel 8 Pro and the Nothing Phone 2. And both of those phones do not have very smooth or reliable experiences when using their respective camera apps. And so even though the actual camera hardware on the S24 might be a little underwhelming, the camera app itself just does not have any issues whatsoever. And for me, this is such an important aspect a phone needs to get right. And sorry, I should say, yes, the hardware itself is pretty underwhelming, but that doesn't mean you can't capture really nice photos using the cameras on this phone. I mean, that main lens in particular is really reliable in terms of capturing solid results shot after shot. And I've even been able to capture some really nice results using the ultra wide and the 3x telephoto lens. But I think improved hardware would help to make results from both of those lenses in particular even more reliable and even more impressive. But again, I'm very satisfied with the results that I'm able to capture using the entire camera system on this phone. Then if you're into customization like I am, there really is no better option than a Samsung phone. Like I can literally customize my lock screen in almost any way possible. I can customize the layout of the recents menu without sacrificing on fluidity, and even just little things like being able to hide the navigation bar or reordering or even hiding elements from the settings menu, not to mention a stack of other options found within the Good Lock app. And yeah, this thing is just absolutely packed to the brim with customization goodies. My personal favorite customization feature about the S24 though is this home up module found within the Good Lock app. And thanks to this setting here that allows for wider grid sizing options in comparison to what pretty much every other phone on the market allows for, I can create my favorite home screen setup with no app labels and with custom icons thanks to the theme park module, all without needing to use a third-party launcher. And that therefore means I get to retain as much fluidity as possible. Now, it's still not as fluid as Pixel phones or literally any phone running a close to AOSP-based ROM, like Nothing phones, for example, and I genuinely don't know why Samsung hasn't been able to fix this in the many years that they've tried, but to be honest, it is a small price to pay for the level of customization that we get in return. Now, whilst I did just say that this phone is one of the more reliable phones that you can get and that it just works, I should point out that there has been one issue that I've experienced on and off over the past month, which is in relation to GPS and Google Maps. On, I reckon, more than 5 completely separate occasions now, the phone has just been really delayed in terms of tracking my actual location, to the point where I've actually missed turns on more than one occasion simply because Google Maps wasn't updating in real time. So that has definitely been an issue, and I've seen some other users complaining about this with the S24 Ultra as well. So it seems like there's something up with the GPS system on this year's lineup of Samsung phones. And the reason why this isn't a huge issue for me is because I'm hardly using GPS these days, and even when I do, it still does work. It's just that little bit delayed. But for some users, I could see this being a proper deal breaker. So hopefully this is something that can be addressed via a software update sometime soon. I will also say one area that has taken a slight hit with the S24, and this is actually true of almost every phone I've tested this year, is battery life. The S24 does technically have a slightly larger battery compared to the S23, but whilst I raved about the S23's battery life last year and how most days it was sitting at or around 50% at the end of each day for the entire month that I was reviewing it, this time around, the days of ending at around 50% are much, much less common. Like, it still happens very occasionally on days with very light use, but it's been much more common for me to finish each day at or around 20%, which has been pretty disappointing. But like I said, this has kind of been my experience with the battery life on all phones I've been reviewing this year. And so who knows, maybe 2023 was just a golden era of battery life in the Android world at least, and maybe we'll never get back to those ridiculous levels of performance, but fingers crossed I'm wrong and this can be fixed at some point in the near future. I will actually point out, my S24 in particular is using an Exynos chipset for the first time in a couple of years. For the last couple of years, all Samsung flagship phones were running Snapdragon chipsets across the board, and this just made for very consistent results in terms of performance and battery optimization across the board. This is the first year that they've gone back to alternating between Exynos and Snapdragon chipsets depending on the region that the phone is sold in. And so the fact that this phone in particular is running an Exynos chipset, maybe that's the reason as to why I've been experiencing slightly worse battery life compared to last year's S23. I'm not really sure, but that was just a theory I came up with as I was filming this video. But for me, what makes the S24 such a solid phone is 1, its customization flexibility, 2, its solid camera experience, and 3, and possibly more importantly than anything else, its reliability. And so yes, I have actually decided to stick with using this as my main everyday device beyond this review period. Now, of course, the year is still relatively young, so who knows, that may very well change by the end of the year, so stay tuned. But unless nothing ups their camera game big time with the Phone 3, and unless Google lets us hide those 2 pesky widgets from their home screen, then I honestly don't see it happening. Should you get the S24? Well, if you own the S23 or even the S22, probably not. But I mean, yes, if it fits within your budget, then this is a fantastic phone that just works. And for me, that makes it a phone absolutely worth picking up.